So let's jump straight into lava. Could you tell us a little bit about lava?
Yeah, so my thesis is that there's a lot of economic infrastructures to build on the African continent, and I think so many of those can be powered by the blockchain and Web3 tools, as well as primitives. And who's going to do that? It's not going to be government, it's not going to be NGOs, it's not going to be foreign powers. It is entrepreneurs, right? It's builders, it's people rolling their sleeves and building these things from the ground up. The same way fintech startups, they are the financial infrastructure for many countries. My bet is on founders and builders to do that using crypto tools and primitives. So, what's the best way to plug in and support that? It is to back and support them. There's a big funding gap on the continent, but also there's a gap of understanding of various dynamics of different African countries, and I think that's the gap that I am setting up to fill. So Lava is an early stage venture fund that is backing and supporting founders who are focused on the African market. They can be fully based in Africa. They can be projects that are overseas but have a strong focus on the African market. And a lot of my thesis is focused on financial tools and applications, but also where the blockchain solves for trusts, which is another area where there's so many exciting applications that are probably Africa-centric and only things that you'll see on the African continent you might not see elsewhere, and that are in the process of being built right now and will be in the future. So that's an area that I'm focused on as well. And a big part of my work is also bridging different parts of the world ecosystems with African ecosystems, because there's a big gap and there's a big disconnect. And practically speaking, a big part of that is just visas. Many founders and builders on the African continent cannot physically attend global events, global gatherings, travel around the world unless they have a foreign passport. And so you see quite a discrepancy of founders who can access global infrastructures. So my work is bringing the global infrastructures to Africa and helping connect those to African builders. So that's a big part of my focus on the fund as well.
Wow, that is so exciting. And I actually didn't know that visas were the first hurdle. That's so basic. I didn't even think of that, but I see. On that note, I know you mentioned a little bit about what you want to focus on and what your fund wants to focus on, but do you have a specific investment thesis or something that you're really looking for in founders in Africa?
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time identifying and supporting talent in my previous life. So I'm a very talent-driven and oriented person, and that's a strong lens that I have. And so when you're talking early stage, the main lens that you're looking at is founders and builders, the quality of their thought, how they execute, how they grow. And that's a big thing that I look for and that I'm focused on is just solid founders or long-term builders. And my thesis is that basically, if you think about the stack of financial infrastructures that we need to build, if you pick your lane, you really focus and you know how to execute, you don't run out of money, and you're keeping your eye on the latest developments in the technology and building user-centric products and experiences, then you can be part of the furniture. You can be a category winner and leader in that space. You're not competing with 500 other startups that are doing the exact same thing as you'd have in many other places, right? So my focus is on identifying long-term builders on the continent. I'm really focused on financial services on one area and trust on the other area. So, and I see, unlike Web2 startups, in Web2, a lot of companies drive to be monolith and try to dominate the entire stack under one umbrella. And, I've built things myself, and it is so hard to try to be really good at 15 things at the same time, right? And I think the beauty of crypto is that you can build all these things as Lego pieces that are interoperable and work a lot more closely with each other. So I am very excited to kind of back and support founders who are picking a lane that they want to be the best at and doubling down and executing in that space. Um, and I'm focused a lot on the East and West Africa as part of my thesis. One, because that's where the key centers of gravity are, and that's where I spend the most time and energy. Um, and in terms of just how I go about things as well is, think a lot from first principles. So what problem are we actually solving? Um, and sometimes I'm a little traditional and like to see solid business models that have a revenue base and have a path to scale around it. And then see the world through the user's experience and lens. So I'm very hands-on. So I like to kind of play with the tools that they're building and go through the user journey and experience and trying to find as many holes in the thought process and support those founders.
Amazing. Yeah, this is so exciting. Just on that note, like in 5 to 10 years, you've been working with these founders and long-term talent. You're building, like in and of itself, will of course produce so much value. But what is your final vision for Lava that you see will be achieved through Lava and also through the potential in Africa?
Yeah. So the big potential that I see in the African continent is basically us building really sophisticated economic, societal infrastructures powered by frontier technologies like the blockchain, and basically running multiple layers of services that are customer centric and customer focused, that bring great level of financial access and really competitive financial services that powers our economies. So African economies are growing really fast already, like independent of crypto and Web3, right? Now the question is, are we using the old model to grow them? Or are we going to just jump using latest technologies and infrastructures that we have, which are cheaper, more accessible, more democratized than other things? So it's basically like a race to how we skip now the next few generations of infrastructure building, right? And the other vision that I have and that I want to see with this work is that there's so many young people across Africa that they can access the global economy from where they're at. People like myself, I've had to leave home to access the global economy, right? But you cannot scale my experience to 900 million people, right? So the solution here is a whole lot of young folks who are coming to this world have full economic freedom and can fully realize their economic potential, but using a lot of these tools and the various applications that other founders are building for them. And, with Lava, how I see that kind of going is as the economy grows, as ecosystems grow, as more services become available, then the value return, that's just the byproduct of doing what serves the broader ecosystem, right? So that's a strong belief that I have around it. And my goal is just to back and support the people who are building that future that makes sense for young Africans.
That is so amazing. I actually studied international relations and area studies in my undergrad. Naturally, the only exposure I had to Africa was when I was studying international development and aid. So honestly, I have a very skewed view on private markets in Africa. And also, one of the greatest concerns that I used to study was government regulation or the shakiness of a government institution. So, what are some risks and challenges that you've identified, like bringing Web3, bridging Web3 into Africa, and also in correlation to your vision? What are some things that we should think about and work on together?
Yeah, so I'm talking to a number of governments already across multiple countries. And what I've picked so far is that they're very curious about this space. Some of them are very interested in it. So to give you an example, I think there are more than a dozen African countries that have Startup Act or some sort of startup law. So they want to see more startups happening. They've embedded it to their policies. There, is at least a few handful of countries that have created a sandbox specifically for Web3 and crypto-based projects. Some of them are very founder friendly and privacy friendly. Some of them are not. But the main thing is that they're interested in this space. They're learning, they're figuring it out. So what's really needed from a regulatory lens is that just more education, more bridge building, um, and really helping them understand what they have to benefit and how they have to gain from that. So one of the things that I've been doing when meeting various governments is giving them a very simple statistic of how many people from that country it takes earning $3,000 a month to increase that country's GDP by 1%. So in Zambia, it's a small country of 20 something million people. It takes 6,250 Zambians earning $3,000 a month online to increase the country's GDP by 1%. So, which is massive, right? So giving a path for a lot of the young folks to have real income, express themselves, participate in a global economy from where they're at, I think that's very powerful. That number in Ethiopia, which is 120 million people, it is around 23,000 Ethiopians earning $3,000 a month can increase the country's GDP by 1%. So really helping them see the economic upside from their side, I think is really critical and important. The other bit is, sovereignty is a big part of the conversation in many African countries, not sovereignty from government, but the sovereignty of those governments from various global powers. So specifically
Oh,
looking, 40 out of 54 African countries don't even print their money locally. They get it printed in Europe, and they pay about 6% of the total fiat cash supply as printing fees and transportation costs. So even printing money is so costly to us, and you have to outsource it elsewhere. Now, the majority of the time, those countries say, yeah, sure, you get your money. But then there have been historical times when the leader of that country is not really elected by a specific printing company's host country. And they've said, no, we won't ship you your money. And that means you don't have sovereignty of your own
huh.
financial system, right? Um, there are 14 African countries that were colonized by France. And before the French left, they instituted a new currency called the CFA. And what that constitutes is that 50% of all the foreign income that you have is stored in the French treasury. So 50 cents of every dollar you earn doesn't come to you, it goes to the French treasury. And then the French treasury determines how much money you can print and what interest rates you can have. That's just another example of no sovereignty, right, over your own monetary policy, right? So that's where the Central African Republic made Bitcoin legal tender. I know Zimbabwe, which has had huge inflation, just created its own stable coin that's backed by the gold. And so you're going to see a lot more experiments because African governments, they are trying to get even sovereignty over their own currency and their own monetary policy, right? So I think the risk is if we don't pay enough attention to educate and bring them along the journey, they can really be blockers, especially for centralized companies. And the other risk is that if the rest of the world keeps throwing spammy, shitty, casino-like products on the continent, and then so many more people keep getting scammed, I think that's going to keep slowing that. So it's basically a race between real products and real services that are adding real value and solving real problems that matter, versus scams, right? So if we have enough of a critical mass of solid products, then that creates the right structure for those types of projects to thrive, and for crypto on the continent not to be valued by all the tools that have stolen people's money. And it's one thing stealing money from American users. It's another thing stealing money from a lot of African users, right? So I think that's one risk. I mean, the other major risk is just execution risk, right? I think that's
Mm,
with every fund and every startup. It is, can we really deliver and execute on what we said we're going to do?
mm,
Um, the number one risk that I see with many African founders specifically is that we try to do too many things at once. Um,
mm,
and so we spread ourselves too thin, run out of money, like the very basic
mm,
stuff.
mm.
And I've seen many projects struggle and fail as a result of that. Or we're solving problems that we think a Silicon Valley VC wants to see because it's the
Ah,
best practical. And then when bear markets come, because you're not adding real value or utility, you
mm,
collapse. And we've seen a lot of startups collapse at this time because they've been doing what they think investors want to see instead of starting from first principles. Um, the third risk that I see from execution side, it is racing to create liquidity events sooner than you should before actually adding value or having a real product. I see this pressure on African founders, especially from foreign VCs, to tokenize as soon as possible, to create a lot of liquidity as soon as possible. And some projects, it makes sense to decentralize from day zero. But in a lot of projects, before you introduce a token, you got to add real value. You got to educate your
mm,
community. You got to really
mm,
understand what is it those tokens represent. So
mm,
badly executed initiatives like that also fall apart. Um, and even if they have really good vision, really get great founders. So I see execution risk being, a
mm,
lot bigger than many people think about. It's easy to just focus on regulation. Well, crypto has been
mm,
thriving despite regulation
mm.
across Africa, right? Um, and I really focus a lot on the execution risks.
Amazing. Yeah. Sorry if this sounds so uneducated, but I'm surprised that you didn't mention like a lack of talent as a risk. I think a lot of like I know you mentioned a few times the lack of accessibility, but I can only
Yeah.
imagine that that leads to, a very small pool of people knowing exactly what they're doing. So what's the talent pool like in Africa?
Yeah, there are amazing centers of gravity of developers, of founders, and we're seeing Web2 founders moving to Web3, which is really interesting and exciting. Um, there is developer talent. There are schools that are training developers, um, and what we're seeing is also a diaspora, which is Africans who have lived overseas who have worked in big
Oh,
companies will that return or plug in
mm,
into African projects. So I think that's a part that is
mm,
being addressed in multiple ways. Always need more talent, of course. Um, and companies, when they reach a certain scale, they keep recruiting talent from around the world. And just with distributed work, I know great startups that have hired folks from Ukraine or India or other parts of the world to meet specific gaps. So I think founders find the way around it. Um, but ultimately, what's going to drive that is also just the quality of the founders and how they think and um, how they're able to learn. The worst case scenarios that I've seen is founders who are either non-technical or who don't have a means and a way to understand the technical infrastructure we're trying to build, just keep outsourcing that and it just ends up costing ridiculous amounts of
mm,
money and also just make a lot of big mistakes, things taking long and all of that. So I think having founders who have really good understanding and a close lens of understanding the technical infrastructure uh, become really good at even attracting and building a good talented team around them.
Well, yeah, I see. That's actually very exciting. We've been in this bear market for a while now. I've heard many exciting narratives, but I think the ethos of crypto really shines in a continent like Africa. And we'll be sure to link all of your like social media so that we can follow up on what's happening. And if anyone listening is interested in the future of lava, we'll make sure that there's a way for them to channel you too. So thank you so much, Yosef.
Awesome. Thanks, Esther. Good chatting.
All right.